And if everybody's ready, I will begin. We negate. Contention 1 is maintaining security. Subpoint A is global terrorism. Currently, global terrorism is falling. This deadly 18 of Forbes explains that last year the number of deaths caused by terrorist groups was 27% less than the year before. This is due to NSA surveillance under Section 702, as Brady 18 of Total Security Advisor finds that Section 702 authorizes the intelligence community to target the communications of non-US persons for foreign intelligence. More than 25% of all current US intelligence is based on information collected under Section 702. She continues that without the program, the resulting intelligence gaps would make it easier for terrorists and other foreign adversaries to plan attacks without detection. Unfortunately, the NSA cannot separate domestic surveillance from foreign, as Alderbell 17 of the Century Foundation explains that in the process of spying on foreigners, the NSA cannot help but collect Americans' communications. Thus, to end domestic surveillance, the NSA must end all surveillance. Snow 19 of the Military Times confirms that the precipitous drop in intelligence threatens a comeback of ISIS as insurgencies proliferate in darkness. The impact is reintervention. As to offset the loss in intelligence, the US would deploy troops to combat terrorism. Walt 14 of Foreign Policy explains that if we didn't have the NSA, we'd have to think more seriously about boots on the ground. Historically, the war on terror has been devastating, as Hussein 18 of The Intercept explains that the total death toll from US wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are 480,000. Subpoint B is cybersecurity. As currently, cyber attacks against America are drastically increasing, as PR News in 2020 finds that the number of cyber attacks is up to 4,000 a day aimed at major corporations, governments, and critical infrastructure. Luckily, the NSA's new cyber directorate is defending against these attacks, as Nakashima 19 of Northwest Arkansas writes that the NSA will prevent cyber attacks on government and critical private sector systems. The NSA will identify specific systems within the banking sector vulnerable to hacking, so threat detection personnel can keep an eye out for them. The goal is sharing all unclassified information to build the security of critical infrastructure. Maintaining surveillance is integral to this system, as Goldsmith 13 of New Republic explains that NSA computers scan internet communications in the US to find malware so that it can block the attack and trace back an attack to discover the identity of the threat. This has proven effective, as Nakashima 20 of the Washington Post writes that the NSA recently discovered a major flaw in Microsoft Windows and alerted the firm rather than turning it into a hacking weapon. However, ending surveillance leaves us open to cyber attacks. The impact is breaking the bank, as a financial sector cyber attack could cause a recession, as Bogart 18 of Carnegie explains that the US financial system is the bedrock of the global economy. Attacks against the financial sector could have catastrophic effects on the economy directly through loss of revenue, as well as indirectly through losses in consumer confidence. Due to America's vast trade linkages, a domestic recession would spill over globally. This would be devastating, as Alexander 10 of Global Policy finds that the worldwide recession pushed 100 million people below the poverty line. Contention 2 is disease surveillance. As COVID has shifted the NSA towards a health focus, as Shannon 20 of Cyberscoop explains that the NSA has historically not had a health lead because until recently, health issues tended to be local matters. This shift is crucial to stopping future pandemics, as Mianka 14 of Medical Daily continues that whereas traditional disease surveillance may take weeks to identify an outbreak, the collection of signals intelligence as well as the analysis of Google searches allows the government to predict future epidemics. Critically, NSA metadata is integral to this surveillance, as Rajenstein 20 of Lawfare explains that COVID could drive surveillance to a much higher level. GPS-enabled smartphones can allow health authorities to determine with whom infected individuals have had contact, and governments can use databases of phone numbers and email addresses to proactively notify them of exposure and use location data to monitor quarantines. Disease surveillance has proven effective, as Lee 20 of Business Insider writes that Taiwan has been successful at containing the coronavirus, reporting 7 deaths because many residents have their location data collected for contact tracing. The impact is preventing pandemics, as factory farms are making another pandemic inevitable, as Coleman Hitty 20 of New York Daily finds that factory farms are the perfect breeding ground for disease. These operations house tens of thousands of animals in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, and the WHO has said a future pandemic from an influenza virus like bird flu is a certainty. Preventing this outbreak is key, as COVID proves the consequences, with Mega 20 of Nature reporting that the number of COVID deaths could exceed 3 million people by January, and Strohacker 20 of Reuters finds that the coronavirus could push 500 million people into poverty. Thus, we negate.
Okay, a couple things before we read case. First, can I see evidence?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, on your first contention, can I see the, I think it was ATAPO evidence that we spy on foreigners when we spy on Americans when we spy on foreigners. Then Snow and Walt saying that we'll redeploy.
And also, I'd like.
Well, I mean, it's all in a line, so I can just give them all of them.
Like to see Lee.
Do you want me to put the ones that I wanted to chat? Because there are a couple.
All right. Sorry, let me just do these first 3 first, and then you can tell me the other ones.
You can just tell me the other ones. I can do it while he's doing that.
Yeah, sure. And then on your second contention about pandemics, just the Shannon evidence.
Yeah.
I'd like to see the Lee evidence on the pandemic.
Okay.
I can get Lee.
I said Shannon.
Can- All right, and I just sent Lee.
All right, I got it. So I can read case if everyone's ready. And can everyone hear me
Oh
well?
no, Jack, don't read case yet. Our AF case before we start talks about mass incarceration and the war on drugs. So I'm going to put a Google form in the chat, and if everyone could fill out the Google form, we would appreciate that. And then when we get 3 responses, we have an alternate case that we can run. It's completely anonymous if you're not comfortable with us reading this argument. I have only 2 responses so far. I don't know if everyone got a chance to fill it out. But then once we get 3 responses, Jack can read case. Okay, now it looks like everyone's filled it out. Jack, everyone's okay with it.
Cool. Can everyone hear me well? Okay. Walt Whitman affirms the National Security Agency or NSA should end its surveillance of U.S. citizens in lawful permanent residence. Contention 1 is privacy. If we do not end surveillance, in coming years will entail egregious violations of Americans' privacy. Richards 13 of Harvard finds that the next 15 years will see an unraveling of privacy as consumers agree to be surveilled by companies that data is then transferred from the private sector to the government. Privacy violations erode Americans' trust in government, as Geiger ATM Pew finds that 57% of Americans believe it is unacceptable for the government to monitor the communications of U.S. citizens. As privacy unravels in coming years, trust in government will plummet. Empirically, Walsh of U.S. News finds that 2013 revelations of NSA surveillance dropped trust in government by a full 5 percentage points. Restoring confidence is crucial, as the OECD confirms that governmental trust is the foundation upon which the legitimacy of public institutions is built and allows the government to do everything from collect taxes to battle pandemics. Excuse me. Contention 2 is norms. Zetter 14 of Wired explains that the NSA spying has allowed the governments of other countries to justify their own surveillance programs, paving the way for censorship and oppression in Pakistan, Cuba, India, China, and more. Thankfully, restoring the integrity of American privacy can now stop democratic backsliding in other countries. Frederick 20 of the CAS finds that by ending surveillance, established democracies like the US would create a model for the use of technology globally that helps ensure the preservation of individual freedom and liberty. In addition to violating basic human rights, censorship damages the economy. As Bellinger 90 of Boise State finds that democratic backsliding reduces foreign investment as much as 300%, as investors flee when they fear the government will meddle with their businesses. Backsliding must not occur, as Khan 90 of Wuhan University finds that right now transitional economies are expanding production through foreign investment that has the potential to lift millions out of poverty. Contention 3 is incarceration. The NSA shares info with the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, playing a key role in the war on drugs. Sodec 13 of The Verge finds that the DEA uses NSA data to launch investigations into Americans for drug crimes. Without the NSA, the war on drugs would be significantly weakened. As Sledge 14 of the Huffington Post finds that NSA plays a crucial role in DSA narcotics operations. NSA surveillance may create the conditions for the war on drugs. Indeed, Blossom 13 of Privacy SOS finds that the collection of mass amounts of data is ripe for a drug war because it allows the government to arrest anyone with a small connection to a nonviolent crime. As a result, Murik 19 of The Hill finds that the war on drugs has led to an epidemic of incarceration largely along racial lines. Indeed, Hayes 20 of the AAF finds that 500,000 Americans are currently in jail for drug offenses, most arrested for drug possession, a nonviolent crime. Incarceration shuts people out from work and prevents them from accessing benefits, pushing families into intergenerational poverty. The CCC concludes that without excess incarceration as a result of drug policies, American poverty would fall 20%, lifting over 9 million Americans out of poverty. Contention for cyber attacks. NSA hacking intentionally undermines American cybersecurity. Reuters 20 finds that the NSA places backdoors into companies and products, which are essentially hacks, making them easier to surveil, creating easy targets for hackers to exploit. Sadly, Delaney and 17 of NBC News finds that these backdoors have been repeatedly stolen and leaked into the hands of hackers, causing widespread economic damages. Without ending surveillance, Sanger 17 of the New York Times finds that cyber attacks manufactured by the NSA will cause colossal damage to American business. Specifically, Me 18 of Harvard finds that attackers will exploit major financial institutions, making cyber attacks a likely cause of the next global recession. The Lancet 16 concludes that the global economic crisis of 2008 killed 500,000 people as people lost jobs and governments cut healthcare spending, shutting people out from accessing basic healthcare services. Thus we affirm. Are you ready for cross?
And before y'all start cross, can I just see the SUDAC evidence on the C3 about the DEA?
Okay.
Jack, you got that?
Oh, also, could I get the link evidence on the C4 too?
Do you want me to send it all?
Sorry, what?
Do you want me to send all the link evidence?
Just like the one that says like the NSA is responsible for the 0 days.
Oh, sure. Okay, I sent the stuff on cyber.
I also sent Sodec.
I got SODEC and waiting on cyber. I'll Shoutout, which I just got. Thank you.
All right, cool. You ready for cross?
Oh, cool. Are you ready for crossfire then?
Yeah.
All right. Is it okay if I ask the first question?
Go for it.
All right, cool. So like on your contention too about norms, can we agree that countries like the leaders of China and Cuba probably want to maintain their power?
China and Cuba specifically, sure. Can I get a question?
And like authoritarian leaders in general.
Okay. Our C2 is not about authoritarian countries. It is about transitional countries, or like swing states that are on like the edge of either becoming a democracy or an authoritarian state.
And they're transitioning because authoritarians are gaining power, right? Because they're democracies right now.
We're not saying that the authoritarians are getting power. We're saying that right now in the status quo, they're not leaning in any specific direction. Can I get a question?
Sure.
Okay. On your C3 on pandemics, your Lee evidence just tells me that one of the methods that Taiwan used to contain COVID was using surveillance. It also gives you like 5 other reasons on how they're able to like contain the COVID pandemic. How is surveillance the only thing that like the end all be all on like preventing future pandemics?
Well, sure. So like one, we would say that surveillance uniquely allows you to catch pandemics in the earliest stages, which is what uniquely allows you to solve for it early. Like I'm sure Taiwan did like other aggressive policies, but those aggressive policies happened after the pandemic already became a problem, right? But surveillance lets you catch the pandemic before it becomes a problem, and that's why it's the most effective form of stopping it. But is it okay if I ask a question?
Didn't China use surveillance in like the pandemic spread in China?
I mean, to my knowledge, I have no idea what China did with pandemic surveillance, so I can't really answer that question.
Okay. Do you have a question? Yeah.
Sure. So like on your contention 4 about like cyber operations, like, or sorry, sir, like, are you just saying that like if the NSA plugs these back doors, like all cyber attacks go away?
We say like a great deal of them go away.
Well, what does a great deal mean? Like how many cyber weapon or attacks actually involve like NSA weapons?
I don't know if that number is quantifiable. I feel like that's probably classified. Can I get a question?
Sure.
Okay. On your C1, your evidence just says that while spying on foreigners, like we collect data on like domestic surveillance. How can you like, just from this evidence, how can you make the assertion that this means that we have to end foreign surveillance when we end domestic? No, it's like that's
So,
not what
well, no, our evidence says that when the NSA collects information under Section 702, right? Like Section 702 collects like communications between like Americans and like foreigners. They collect intelligence on foreigners, and in that process, innocent like American communications get caught in like the dragnet, right? So if the resolution is asking us to end domestic surveillance, it is impossible for the NSA to operate Section 702 without incidentally collecting American surveillance. So if you end it, you end Section 702.
That's not what the evidence says. You're like,
Yes, it is. It's
no. Okay. Do you have a question?
sure. So really quickly on like your contention one about privacy, like if the Snowden revelation was like 7 years ago, why hasn't your impact like manifested?
Okay, we're saying that, well, I think it has manifested. It was pretty hard for the US to fight the COVID pandemic because people don't trust the government. They don't want to listen to mask protocols. Now people like don't want to take the vaccine. I feel like if people had higher trust in the government, they'd be willing to do things like this.
Like 5% higher in the government? I like it.
Yeah.
Is that time?
Yeah.
We'll start prep.
Yeah, we're gonna start prompt.
Jack, call me.
Okay, that was a minute 07.
Oh,
The
sorry.
order-
Just to clarify, there's been some controversy in our previous rounds as to whether we have 4 or 3 minutes of prep for this tournament. How have y'all been doing it?
We've been doing 3 all tournament, but I mean, I don't really.
We're fine with either. It's just, yeah.
It's fine.
We were under the impression it was 4. So if you guys want to do that and if the judge is okay with it, it's 3.
It says 3.
Okay.
It's actually going to start on their C3, or sorry, their C4 about 0 days, and then it'll be top down. Cool. Is everybody set? Okay. And it's also going to go kind of fast. Just clear me if you need me to. All in 0 days, first tournament, NSA has stopped 0 days because of surveillance. Reuters 15 explains the NSA has historically disclosed over 91% of all vulnerabilities discovered. This is only increased as Nakashima from our case finds the NSA has adopted a larger cybersecurity role and very recently disclosed a massive exploit rather than weaponizing it. That's why Leonard 20 confirms in the first 6 months of 2020, the number of people affected by data breaches dropped 60%. Their uniqueness is terrible. Unfortunately, Voting Pro ends the surveillance of internet communications, which enables the NSA to find these vulnerabilities in the first place, which increases hacks. Second, you can delink it. The NSA continues 0 days on foreign targets. Pro 19 of the New York Times finds China was found to have used NSA 0 days after stealing them from an NSA attack on their systems, so hackers can still steal NSAs or 0 days. Third, people don't even install the patches. Rhyme 16 of CSO explains most cyber attacks are vulnerabilities that were patched up a year ago because it takes an organization 18 months to install the patch, so their 0 days impacts happen either way. Fifth, hackers just pivot to the private sector. NG20 of CNN 2 weeks ago confirms hackers stole cyber weapons from the cybersecurity firm for FireEye. If they're doing it from the NSA right now, if you vote for them, all they do is just go steal it from the private companies. On their first three contentions, group it together, a massive turn, credit the 20th slate fines, that the NSA is now getting more congressional and judicial oversight because of the USA Freedom Act dedicated to upholding the First Amendment. This is solving back for all three of their arguments. However, the government loves surveillance. Patrick 19 of Inside Sources explains Biden has been a massive supporter of mass surveillance, and Whitaker 19 of ZDNet finds Congress reauthorized mass surveillance in 2018. This means that when you affirm the resolution, that does not mean the end of surveillance, but rather the reallocation of NSA surveillance resources to institutions capable of doing surveillance. The first one that would go to is the DAA. Hawk 15 of USA Today explains historically the DAA has had the capability to surveil billions of calls. This is comparatively worse than the NSA for privacy. As Heath continues, the DAA searched through American data as many times the NSA did in 1 year or 1 day, and did so without any judicial oversight, whereas the NSA does. This turns not only their first contention, their second contention, but also completely turns their third contention. The second institution is the FBI. As Fan 20 of the Intercept explains, the FBI is growing its tools for mass surveillance by contracting with several surveillance companies for tech, boosting resources to the FBI over the NSA's worst for privacy. Aronson 19 of Intercept explains the FBI is the most prolific miner of American data, making 3.1 million searches through the FISA compared to only 7,500 by the NSA. Once again, this also turns all three contentions. But on their first contention about domestic privacy, number one, the NSA doesn't even unmask many people, even though it collects a lot of metadata. It only actually goes through and searches that on a couple of people. Griffin 19 of Daily Mail finds only 17,000 Americans were unmasked by the NSA. But on this impact about government mistrust, number one, trust is already low. Pew Research Center 20 wrote that trust in the government is lower than ever, with only 20% of adults trusting the government to do the right thing. This has two implications. Number one, their argument should already be happening since trust is so low, but it's not, which means the argument is probably not true. Second, they need to prove how much more trust is going to go down to get any offense, which they can. Second, there are alternate causes why people mistrust the government. For example, Congress promised a COVID stimulus package. They didn't follow through with it. They don't really solve back. Third, the Snowden leak should have triggered their impact. There was massive mistrust during the Snowden leak, but nothing really happened. Fourth, you can turn it because low trust actually equals more advocacy. When people don't trust their governments, they're more likely to vote to try and fix the system. This is proven by the Trump election because people didn't trust Trump, but there's like massive voter turnout. On their second argument about international authoritarianism, first, authoritarians will look towards any scapegoats, two scapegoats. First is Five Eyes Pangan, 18 of Vice finds Five Eyes is a deeply pervasive intelligence sharing partnership between the Western superpowers. Second is U.S. companies. Morgan 19 of Washington Post explains U.S. companies are selling surveillance technologies to authoritarian governments across the world and sending signals that the U.S. doesn't care much about a free internet. That means you don't like their impact figure in both worlds. But on their second argument about like racist surveillance, number one, or like the DAA, number one, NSA info sharing is illegal. Powell reading of CT Post finds it is illegal for the NSA to communicate criminal activity with other agencies about anything other than terrorism. But second, we would say that the FBI is increasing domestic capabilities. The DAA can just use theirs because Right 14 of the Naval Postgraduate explains due to rising domestic threats, the FBI has instituted massive improvements to their domestic surveillance capabilities. Indeed, Bernard 20 of the Hill explains between 2015 and 2019, there were only 2 investigations that the FBI had, that the NSA had intelligence on, that the FBI did not.
On the overview, can I see Franklin? And then just the evidence that we're always going to surveil. Yeah.
The evidence that we're always going to surveil is based on 2 pieces of evidence that says the government loves mass surveillance. Do you want both?
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool.
I said the evidence that says Congress or the government loves mass surveillance. What else did you want?
The Franklin evidence, the first piece of evidence on the NSA reforming stuff. Like the first piece of evidence on the overview.
That's fine. I sent the ISA stuff.
All right, I'll refresh, and then when we get it, Jack's gonna call me, and we'll take some prep. All right, Jack, call me. Starting prep now. going to be straight down RFDs. Okay. On the overview, none of their evidence says that the NSA is actually reforming. Our Richards evidence from case indicates that the NSA still has a massive surveillance program that is violating Americans' privacy, and they've also conceded the second part of the Richards evidence, which says that even if the NSA is reforming right now, the next 15 years will see an unraveling of privacy. They don't contest that, which means even if we're reforming right now, it doesn't matter. They say that the DAA is going to start surveilling. None of their evidence actually says that. I would say we're fiating an abolishment of the NSA. It's probably like abusive for them to read a counterplan saying that surveillance is always going to exist. But also, all their evidence says that the DAA and FBI are already surveilling in these squad. There's no unique offense for them. Also, this overview does not take out our second contention insofar as the Zetter evidence indicates specifically it is NSA spying that is used to buy a scapegoat for other countries. So let's go to our second protension. This is where we're winning. They make one response and it's all saying that they're going to scapegoat other things, but that completely ignores our Zetter evidence, which says that the NSA specifically is what other countries look to scapegoat because it's the government's apparatus for surveillance. They've also conceded the Frederick evidence, which gets us out of this, saying that if we change right now, we can stop countries from backsliding into authoritarianism. They concede the entire impact that authoritarianism reduces FDI, pushing millions of people into poverty. That's going to be the biggest impact later in the round. On our first argument about privacy, we'll concede that there are all causes for mistrust, and on our fourth contention about cyber, the only turns are their case. Go to their case. On terrorism, 2 turns. First, PIU 18 of ZME Science finds that the NSA collects so much data that there's information overload that makes it impossible for the government to identify and track terrorists. This is why the government couldn't stop the Boston bombing. Solomon 15 and Fortune finds that terrorist attack happened because, not despite of surveillance, because the CIA is so swamped with data that can do nothing to stop terrorism. But second, you turn to NSA surveillance causes radicalization in the first place. As Rogers 19 finds that anti-terrorism measures come at the expense of civil liberties, which GAP rights are specifically used to target Muslim Americans. Sadly, Sci 15 writes that repression and authoritarianism breed terrorism by radicalizing religious actors, weakening moderates, and increasing support for extremism by making religion a point of cohesion against the state. Also, let's go to their link. They say that we spy on foreigners and we spy in the U.S. Well, we're fiating ending only domestic surveillance, so the government could just change the apparatus that it uses to spy on foreign surveillance. They just make the assertion that we'll end foreign surveillance pretty abusive. The government has a vested interest in keeping foreign surveillance. They'll do it either world. Their Walt evidence saying that we'll put boots on the ground says that as long as we have drones, we won't put boots on the ground. And insofar as they're not getting rid of drones, they don't change this. Their evidence saying that wars kill 480,000 just as these wars kill 480,000, but they don't once prove that troops on the ground equal war. That's a link that should have been in case. Don't let them read it later. Go to cyber. 4 pieces of uniqueness prove that our argument about cyber is more true than theirs. First, the White House finds that we're already losing $109 billion to cyber attacks every year. Third, Delta finds that attacks are increasing 273%. That's the warrant they read in their case from PR News, saying we're getting attacked with 4,000 cyber attacks every day. Clearly, the NSA isn't stopping us. Fourth, the Sanger evidence on our case indicates that government's going to use, there's going to be colossal damage to American businesses if we don't change anything, meaning clearly the status quo disproves their argument. They say per Goldstein that we need surveillance. There's no warrant as to why we need metadata for the government to identify vulnerabilities. The NSA cybersecurity directory is completely different from the Prism, what it uses to surveil, meaning that happens in either world. On their specific link, 2 responses. First, Vols finds that the NSA doesn't actually disclose vulnerabilities, just hoards them to use for later use. Second, Nix finds that the NSA, you turn it because Nix finds that the NSA purposely bribes companies to keep their cybersecurity low. Let's go to their second contention about diseases. Their evidence from Shannon saying that the NSA is changed to health does not say that the NSA is doing surveillance to stop pandemics. It says that it's preventing cyber attacks for the vaccine. That is not their link. They just misconstrue this evidence so much, but there are 3 reasons why the government will always surveil either way. A, the CDC is right now collecting data on COVID, so even if we abolish the NSA, the CDC will always surveil. Second, Sabine finds that the government is collecting data from Google and Facebook. It can always get data in either world, even if the NSA doesn't do its own surveillance. And third, Dice finds that MIT and Harvard just created their own surveillance apparatus that is giving data to the government, meaning the government always has surveillance. They say that we can contain the virus, but Huang finds that the United States will never be able to use surveillance to contain the virus. A, because the government has less power than it does in other authoritarian countries like China, but second, because there's a fundamental distrust of the government in the United States. It means people don't listen to social distancing. At the bottom, you turn it because Fox finds that surveillance actually hurts pandemic apparatuses for 2 reasons. A, because it harms internet freedom. Like in China, people didn't know that the virus was spreading for 3 months because the government cracked down. But second, people have a fundamental distrust of the government when they think they're spying on them and they don't listen to social distancing measures.
Before we start, can I just see the evidence about bribing companies? It's the 4th response in cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And can I also just know the date on the 3rd response about hoarding vulnerabilities?
Yeah.
Also, just to clarify, So after the Google response on the pandemics, like the fourth one about like the government fill-in, like what institution was it?
So it was first CDC, second Google and Facebook, third MIT and Harvard.
Oh, MIT. Okay.
Okay, I'm sending the evidence that says that they bribed companies. And then I'll get you the date on the hoarding vulnerabilities thing. Yeah, it's from October 2020.
Sorry, October 2020? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm set for cross.
All right, cool. You can have first question.
So could you give me an example of one of these transition states that is sliding into authoritarianism?
India. Can I take your question?
Just really quickly. So like India, right?
Mhm.
What are the indicators that it is sliding into an authoritarian state?
Modi's concentrating power. He's increasing surveillance on his people, cracking down domestically. Can I take the question?
Sure, but is India's economy, like before COVID, was it decreasing or increasing?
Doesn't really matter insofar
Well,
as
it kind of does, right? Because your entire argument is that when countries transition into authoritarian, their economies go down. Your only example is India, but before COVID, India's economy was skyrocketing because of the increase in data infrastructure.
Are you gonna let me respond? So you asked me for one example. We have other examples in case. We say Pakistan, Cuba, India, China. Also, it doesn't really matter if their economy is going down insofar as you conceded the con evidence, which said that they're accepting FDI that has the potential to lift millions out of poverty right now. So even, like their economy going down doesn't take out our money. Can I take a question?
Okay, sure.
Why do we need surveillance to identify vulnerabilities in cyber infrastructure?
Yeah, because let me get it for you. Goldsmith evidence says that the NSA scans the internet to find the malware that is attacking these systems. When you scan the internet, that is considered domestic surveillance because,
That
like you said, that's quote unquote hurting internet freedom.
Sure. Is that domestic surveillance on American citizens though? Or is the internet an American citizen?
The internet is being used by American citizens. So when you surveil the internet, you also surveil American citizens. Do you mind if I have a question?
Sure.
On this idea about like the whole norm setting and stuff, you say that right now it's just the NSA. If the NSA goes away, why wouldn't these countries just use another scapegoat?
So we say from Zetter that specifically NSA public spying, which is the apparatus that the United States uses right now to surveil, is the scapegoat that other countries are using.
I understand that Zetter says that, but my question is, when you affirm and you end NSA surveillance, what is stopping all of these countries who really, really want to be authoritarian from just scapegoating any other surveillance program America has or any of the other two scapegoats I read in like rebuttal?
What, like U.S. companies? How do they scapegoat
Yes.
companies?
The evidence is actually really bomb. You should probably call for it if you want. It says U.S. companies are sending a really terrible signal that the U.S. is a really bad hypocrite, very similar to the NSA surveillance. Which is why Ian's going to come up here and say that's probably going to fill in for the NSA scapegoat that you're talking about. But if you want to have a question.
I don't have one. You can have another.
Sure. On this idea about like the impact about the econ and like the whole, stopping the slide, what's the time frame?
5 years, 4 months, and 34 days. I can't give you a time frame. We say they're accepting FDI right now. If they become authoritarianism, FDI gets reduced by 300%.
Okay. We'll start some prep.
All right. That was a minute 40 seconds used, so we should have like 20 seconds left. It's just going to be like responding to the turns, our case, Wang, and then their case. All right, cool. So if everybody's ready, then I'll begin. So on our first contention about terrorism, they read this about overload, but Tucker 20 finds that the NSA is using AI now, which calls back for overload, prefer our evidence because it's more recent. Then they read this argument about you increase radicalization. They literally read no impact about how much terrorism is going to increase. You can't give them any offense on this. On pandemics, we'll concede that the CDC fills in, which means that it kicks out of both their turns. On cybersecurity, this is where you're voting for us. We tell you there are 4,000 cyber attacks on American critical infrastructure every day, but nothing is manifested because our Goldsmith evidence finds that the NSA scans communication networks to find malware, to block attacks, and trace them back to the original source, protecting our infrastructure. But if surveillance goes away, we lose the shield. They have a couple responses. You can group their first two about cyber attacks increasing together, because that argument is about small businesses. It's not about our argument, which is about defending critical infrastructure, which means it's not responsive. Then they tell you that their evidence says that 0 days are going to do damage to American businesses. One, they don't tell you how much damage. Two, our Nakashima evidence from this year posts their evidence and finds that as of 2019, the NSA released a new cyber directorate, which they now focus on defense, which is why they disclose a vulnerability to Microsoft instead of using it for a hacking weapon for our evidence on recency. Then they tell you that you can do it. Then they tell you it's not surveillance. Nowhere Goldsmith evidence finds that scanning communication networks definitionally requires surveillance. You can call for the card. It's really good. Second, lastly, they tell you that they read this trend about making companies have less surveillance. Once again, that's not responsive to our argument on critical infrastructure. And also, they don't read an impact. It doesn't matter. At that point, you can vote for us on our impact. The Borgard evidence finds that an NSA cyber attack against the financial sector could cause a recession by reducing investor confidence in the economy, and that could push 100 million people into poverty. We say that we're going to outweigh them on three fronts. First is on scope. We're impacting to 100 million people. You literally have no idea how many people they're impacting with their norms argument. Second, on severity, because they tell you in their own case that the recession killed 500,000 people. Their only argument is about poverty. Death is more severe than poverty because death is irreversible. Poverty isn't. But lastly is on a Lincoln. It says the economy is doing really bad. It allows authoritarian leaders to build up national sentiment in order to blame someone for the economic downturn. That allows them to rise to power. Look to Hitler rising to power during World War II for an empiric. Go to their case. They really mishandled the fill-in overview. Our Whittaker evidence finds that Congress and Biden both love surveillance, which means just because you end the NSA surveillance, that doesn't mean you end US surveillance. It just means you reallocate NSA resources to other places. They just say our evidence doesn't say we reallocate resources. Sure, our evidence also doesn't say we're ending the NSA because we're not. Our argument is that when you end the NSA, because Congress has an incentive, you just reallocate resources. So this is really important because we tell you that when you reallocate resources to people like the FBI, they just fill in, which means that you just provide another scapegoat authoritarian leaders can use to justify their expansion because you're not actually ending surveillance, you're just reallocating the resources. But then on their second argument about norms specifically, they don't respond to either of ACOT's responses. The first is that the NSA seems scapegoat Five Eyes Alliance, which is European countries that also fail or spy on their citizens. And second, US companies are literally selling a technology, surveillance technology to authoritarian leaders, which is a really bad signal that the US doesn't care about setting good norms. They just say their evidence says the NSA specifically. Sure, it says the NSA specifically because the NSA is the scapegoat right now. But given that authoritarian leaders always have an incentive to rise to power and do something to justify their authoritarianism, they're just going to shift to scapegoat these other things in their world. That's why this argument really doesn't matter. They have literally no offense.
All right. I guess we'll see the U.S. companies scapegoat the evidence.
Sorry, I accidentally had you muted.
I guess we'll see the U.S. companies scapegoat response.
Cool. We just sent it.
Awesome. I'll refresh. Okay, I got it. Jack, can you call me?
All right, that was. I think we have 10 seconds left.
How much did we use before? Because I had that as 155.
We had 45. So.
Oh, okay. So we have 20 left.
Okay. Is everyone good? Cool. It's going to start on their case. I'm going to weigh, and then I'll move back to their case. Okay.
Just real quick before you start, is the Wayne interactive with our Wayne or is it like new Wayne?
I'll interact. I'll make it spontaneous and interactive.
Sick. Sounds good.
Okay. Let's begin. Start on the top of the turn on security. NSA surveillance causes radicalization in the first place. Rogers 19 finds that anti-terrorism measures cause the expense of civil liberties, while the GAP rights are specifically used to target Muslim Americans. Sadly, SIA 15 writes that the repression and authoritarianism breed terrorism by radicalizing religious actors, weakening moderates, and increasing support for extremism by making religion a point of cohesion against the state. Their only response to this turn is that we don't have an impact. We don't tell you how much terrorism increases, but we're just co-opting our opponent's impacts. Remember, our opponents tell you that when terrorism increases, it leads to boots on the ground, which leads to 580,000 people dying. That's our impact. It's the clearest impact on the ground. But now let's weigh. We get weigh in strength of link. Remember that this link is 100% conceded. It's really easy to vote off of. But also, our opponents just tell you that like you should prioritize death over poverty. Okay, we're directly linking it to death, so prioritize death over poverty. But third, you can link in. Because remember, when terrorism happens, it costs countries' economy, which hurts their GDP. Specifically, Jones tells you that terrorism costs countries 9% of their GDP. This can specifically link into their link in, because when countries' economies are hurt, it leads to more authoritarianism. We're just leading to the root cause of authoritarianism, and also we're solving for the root cause of terror, because the root cause of terror is people being radicalized. Go to their case. They really mishandled the Voles evidence. Voles tells you that essentially right now that there's no disclosure on when the NSA finds attacks, they don't disclose them to private businesses. They have this hasty generalization where they give you one example of how the NSA disclosed stuff to Microsoft. This is one example. You can't really vote off it. But anyway, because of this, Sanger tells you that attacks are increasing the status quo. In fact, attacks are up 273%. To this extent, it's really hard to vote off them. They're just trying to tell you that these attacks only represent like attacks on small businesses. We don't interact with their link on critical infrastructure. This is like irrelevant. Like these attacks going up 273% is on critical infrastructure. That's why we've lost $109 billion from these attacks. They're like really damaging to our economy. Clearly, what we're doing right now in the status quo isn't working. Our opponents have no uniqueness. It's really hard to vote off them here. Go to our case. On this overview at the top, they're just telling you that there's going to be reallocation in the FBI and the CIA and like CIA and the DEA are going to fill in. But all of our opponents' evidence tells you that the FBI and DEA are surveilling within the United States in the status quo. This means that our opponents can't get any unique offense here. But also remember that right now only the NSA is the people acting against terrorism, not the FBI or CIA or like DEA. Anyway, don't let them try and link it to authoritarianism, because realize that their economy is not being helped, but also specifically on our link, they try and tell you that there's going to be like alt causes. There's alt causes that leads to authoritarianism. Realize that there aren't any alt causes. What's happening right now is people are specifically scapegoating the NSA, which leads to a rise in authoritarianism.
Are y'all down to skip Grand?
Yeah.
Do y'all just want to?
So do y'all want to like replace it with like 2 minutes of prep? That's what like we've done in the past when we skip Grand, or do you just want to like skip it all together and not do prep?
How about you can get like a minute before final?
All right, sounds good.
Okay. Because I understand you usually would prep.
Yeah. Okay. We'll start that now then. All right. It's going to start on the terror turn, our case and their case, and I'll be weighing in between. Okay. Let's start on the terror turn. They say that terror increases equals boots on the ground. First, they conceded the uniqueness from our case that terror is declining. Clearly, that our argument isn't true. Number two, by their own drones defense, terror only increases if drones go away. We both agree drones don't go away. Doesn't matter. But on the strength of the link, Wayne, there's literally no war. Don't evaluate the Wayne. On the severity, Wayne, 500,000 deaths are more than an unquantifiable amount of their quote-unquote severity deaths. On their linking into the economy, this GDP impact is new in summary. Don't evaluate it. Number two, a global recession is probably going to be outweighing some terror economy impact. We're always winning. Don't evaluate the blippy terror turn. Go to cybersecurity. We tell you that there are 4,000 cyber attacks on critical infrastructure every day, but nothing bad has happened because the Goldsmith evidence says the NSA monitors the internet and critical systems to prevent the attack. You can extend the impact. The Borgard evidence says that a cyber attack on the financial sector could cause a global recession that pushes 100 million people into poverty, but NSA surveillance prevents that. They only extend one response that attacks are increasing. They miss Keane's frontline. He finds that even though attacks are increasing, nothing has happened to critical infrastructure because our cybersecurity argument is working. Prioritizing Nakashima evidence is the most recent evidence after the new cyber director that now says that the NSA is disclosing its exploits and is focusing on cybersecurity. We're winning the argument. Go to the Wayne. We tell you that we link into their own arguments because economic deprivation increases authoritarianism, and it probably also increases like terrorism. If we're gonna do new Wayne, what might as well. They agree like we can't link in no war. Why? Our linking is fine. Also on scope, we impacted 100 million people. You have no idea how much their impacts are on their case.
Really quickly, our impact on terrorism is only 480,000
Oh, yeah,
deaths.
that's fine.
Congress estimates 500,000.
Yeah, that's fine. 500,000 is more than their 480,000 terror deaths, so that's fine. On their case, there's literally no way you can vote here. They conceded the alt cause. The Pembroke 18 evidence says that people can just scapegoat the Five Eyes, which is like the Western like coalition of intelligence, and the Manga 18 evidence says that U.S. companies are also selling surveillance tech. All they say is that the better evidence says that it's NSA specific. They don't respond to Keane's backline that says, yeah, that's right now because the NSA is what is like the big thing. But the moment the NSA goes away, authoritarian governments still have an incentive to like be in power, so they scapegoat all of these other things. It is such terminal defense.
Jackson, to call me and reconnect. When we connect, we'll take last 20 seconds. Just going to be terrorism and then cyber. Extend our terrorism turn. NSA surveillance causes radicalization in the first place. As Rogers 19 that anti-terrorism measures come at the expense of civil liberties, which the GAP writes were specifically used to target Muslim Americans. Sadly, Sci 15 writes that repression and authoritarianism breed terrorism by radicalizing religious actors, weakening moderate increase in support for extremism, and making religion a point of cohesion against the state, meaning NSA surveillance is the root cause of terrorism in the first place. They conceded this turn in summary, so they make two new responses in first final focus. First, they say that terrorism is decreasing, but this is a short-term blip. We say the root cause of all terrorism, hundreds of thousands of deaths in the past, is NSA surveillance. Just because terrorism is going down this year doesn't take out the turn. We're still saving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths onto the future. Then they try to concede a deal that I read in rebuttal in first final focus. Really abusive. They say drones aren't going away. That does not respond. We say the reason why we have troops in the ground in the first place right now is because there's NSA surveillance that is radicalizing religious actors, causing people to turn to terrorism. We say you pull those troops out, co-op their impact of wars killing 580,000 people. They really botched this. Let's go to the Wang. We're also winning here. We say this outweighs on strength of link. There are absolutely zero responses in summary to this argument. I'll extend the Vols evidence on their case, which casts a lot of doubt on their link. But second, we say we link in because our Jones evidence indicates, which they concede causes terrorism causes countries 10% of GDP in the long term, which also outweighs on time frame because at best recessions are short term. People come back out of poverty, but we say you cripple sustained development in developing countries, which causes long term poverty, outweighing any impact they read on recessions. They just say it's new in summary. There's no reason they give why it's abusive to read new Wang in summary insofar as we collapse on this turn in second summary. Let's go to their case. Even if we weren't winning our link and our weighing, we're still putting terminal defense on their case because in final focus, they extend absolutely zero response to the Vol's evidence, which is that even if the NSA identifies vulnerabilities in the system, it does not disclose them, whether they're on critical infrastructure or private businesses, which 100% takes out their link because their link is NSA finds vulnerabilities and then identifies them and patches them up. They just read a lot of blippy weighing and final focus saying they outweigh. Well, I would say, A, we link into their impact, so if you think they have a bigger impact, we're still winning the round. Good round.
Good round, y'all. Yeah, good round.
Good round.
Okay, I'm gonna drop my email. Can I see the evidence for the NSA causes radicalization?
Okay, I sent it.
Okay. So I voted AF in this round. Honestly, I think it could have went either way since both of the teams won the argument they went for. So I default to weighing, and neg only really weighs on scope in the end for final focus. Like there's some other stuff and you answer some other stuff, but it basically just comes down to scope. But I lean more towards the AF Lincoln because if they co-opt it, I guess they get the whole scope of the thing too. So I look to the terrorism contention or subpoint. I had to really think about whether I wanted to vote on this or not because I think that when teams kick out of things, they generally should be able to kick out of things. But I also think that the summary probably didn't extend the right stuff to be able to kick out of it. So I don't evaluate the new stuff in Final Focus, even though it was like in the rebuttal. I don't think it was extended in summary, so I don't think that I can really evaluate it at that point. So there's not much, I guess, other content or responses to the terrorism voting issue, and the evidence is like fine, I guess. So I buy the app stuff and go there.
Thank you. Good luck, guys.
Thank you.
Round. Yeah.
Good round, y'all.